today's topic, the power of tree canopy data to plan, prioritize, and inspire stewardship. This is a two-part mini-series. Today's session is part 2, and we'll focus on connecting with the community. We'll hear from 3 speakers, Jarlath O'Neill Dunne with the University of Vermont and jointly with the U.S. Forest Service, Ian Hanau with Planet Geo, and Earl Uetzler with the District of Columbia. If you have questions during the presentations today, feel free to type them into the group chat and questions pod at the bottom of the screen. We'll have a brief question and answer session for all of our speakers at the end of the webinar. And we're going to be wrapping up today at about 2 p.m. Eastern. Our first speaker, Jarlath O'Neill Dunne, helped develop the Forest Service's Urban Tree Canopy Assessment Protocols in 2005. Since that time, his team has helped more than 70 communities in the U.S. and Canada better understand their green infrastructure through tree canopy mapping. Thanks for being with us today, Jarlath. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thanks to everyone for joining in. So I'm going to give you an overview and background of the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment. And really what I think is great about the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment is it brings balance to your urban and regional planning efforts. So for a long time, we've very much focused on our gray infrastructure planning. We've spent a lot of time thinking about roads and buildings and mapping those features, or perhaps we focused on our tax space. We spend, of course, a lot of money and effort mapping property parcel boundaries. What we've really neglected is our green infrastructure. And what the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment does is it gives you a level playing field. It brings balance to your urban and regional planning efforts by mapping your green infrastructure alongside of your gray infrastructure. So if you're a major city like the city of New York and you embark on a Million Trees initiative, or even if you're just a small community and you're looking to establish an urban tree canopy goal, you probably have a lot of questions. You have questions such as, how much tree canopy do I have right now? Or how much room do we have to plant trees? Where is this land that we have room to plant trees located? And who owns our existing trees? And the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment can help you answer those types of questions. And there are really 5 phases to the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment. We start out by mapping your land cover, mapping what you have right now, your tree canopy and your other land cover types. So we not only can tell you how much tree canopy you have, but where there's room to plant new trees. We then analyze that data for you so that you understand the relationships between tree canopy and your properties, perhaps tree canopy and demographics. We then generate products that help you communicate the message and better communicate the findings of the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment. Because the data are geospatial, which means they're map data, we can integrate them into your existing geospatial support, decision support systems. And then finally, we can come full circle and monitor your tree canopy over time so that we can tell you how your efforts are faring. Are you losing tree canopy? Are you getting tree canopy, and where are those gains and losses occurring? So the foundation for the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment really is map data, specifically high resolution, what we call remotely sensed data, and that can include imagery such as you see here. This is 1-meter imagery from the National Agriculture Imagery Program. Such imagery is great because it's leaf-on, and it's acquired of most places in the United States about every 3 years. In addition to that, we use another data set called LiDAR, or light detection and ranging. This is really unique because it's a laser that's shot from a plane, and don't worry, that laser's not going to hurt you. What it's really good for is it allows us to see through shadows and measure the heights of things. So if you're in a major city with lots of tall buildings, Chicago or New York, this type of data are really useful because we don't have shadowed effects from buildings, and also it's useful for a lot of other communities because we can measure the heights of your trees. And we integrate these data sets to generate high-resolution land cover. And with high-resolution land cover, we're generally mapping 7 classes of land cover, and you see those here: tree canopy, grass and shrub, bare soil, water, buildings, roads and railroads, and other paved surfaces. So unlike the existing maps for your community where you might have parcels mapped, or you've got your buildings mapped, or you've got your roads mapped, now you have everything. Once again, coming back to the fact that you have your gray and green infrastructure mapped together so you can make more holistic and rounded decisions. So once we have that land cover, this is where the real fun starts, and we can begin integrating other data sets to help us better understand not only our current tree canopy situation, but also how we might expand the tree canopy. And so at the smallest or finest scale are the property parcel boundaries, and that's what you see here in black, and each one of these boundaries represents a property parcel. And using the land cover data, we can summarize information for each one of those properties. So here we're showing you the existing tree canopy, which is to say the amount of tree canopy that's there right now as a percentage of land area, So you can imagine how valuable this is, because for each and every single property parcel in this parcel database, you now know the percent of tree canopy. If you want to compare across residential parcels in a development or between your schools, you now have that information. We can also give you information, what we call the possible tree canopy. This is the plantable area. So once again, this represents, as a percent of land area, how much land you have available to plant new trees. And this is just saying that the land is available. It's not saying that it's absolutely the best place. There are a lot of on-the-ground factors we can't map from above. But this is a great starting point when you want to think about how much room do we have to plant new trees. Now, because our property parcel data often includes valuable information such as home ownership costs or land use, we can aggregate that information up to make better decisions. And we're sorry about some of the formatting issues here. We received word before we started the presentation that some of the text got moved around, but hopefully you can read things. So this is a summary of tree canopy for a watershed study that we did. And this really helps you understand who owns the tree canopy in this watershed. From this pie chart, we see that 38% of the tree canopy is owned by the residents. So residents are really important for maintaining tree canopy within the watershed. And then 22% are street trees. These are located in the public rights-of-way. 27% institutional, 10% commercial, and then we have a small agricultural component. So once again, this really helps you look holistically at your watershed, at your community, at your county, whatever scale you're working at, to understand these ownership patterns. Now when it comes to the possible tree canopy, those plantable areas, we can also begin to look at, okay, if we want to have a new tree canopy initiative, where can we make gains? So you can see here, and this is total acreage here, a similar pattern emerges here. We've got a lot of room in the residential, but when we look at the other land uses, we can see that the rights-of-way has a lot less room. So perhaps an indication that there's a lot of street trees already, and our new tree planting initiative is to look beyond those public rights-of-ways, really focus in the residential and commercial lands, and that's a private lands planting initiative. We can also bring up some more interesting patterns. So what we're showing here is each circle represents an individual property parcel for a community. Over on the x-axis, you can see the year that parcel was developed, when the home was built. And on the y-axis, you see the existing tree canopy. And what's interesting about this slide is we're able to understand how previous land use and home ownership patterns influence tree canopy today. So if you look at that area around sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s, you see a lot of properties with very high tree canopy. And so in this community, a lot of the tree canopy resides in communities, or individual parcels that were developed at the turn of the last century. As a result, those trees are probably nearing the maximum lifespan, and this community wants to think about reaching out to those landowners to contact them and think about planting new trees, because those trees might be at the end of their current life. Now, not all tree canopy is created equal. And one of the things that we can do with the tree canopy data set is divide it into different patch classes. We know that larger tree canopy patches or larger forest patches can provide more ecosystem services. So when you think about things like wildlife habitat or other ecosystem services like creating healthy watersheds, large patches are more valuable. And by running some rather fancy patch algorithms, we can take our tree canopy data set and break it into these large, medium, and small patches so you can better understand how your tree canopy are configured in your community. So going back to the earlier slides, you remember we have these wonderful data sets called LIDAR, or light detection and ranging, which are 3D data sets that give us the height of everything across the landscape. Using that information and combined with our tree canopy data that we've mapped, we can produce the average canopy height across your entire community. So here we are, we've taken our tree canopy data set, we've broken it down into polygons that represent largely individual trees, and then for each one of those tree polygons, compute the average canopy height from the LiDAR data. And then we can graph this out, and that's that bar chart that you see in the upper left-hand corner there. And so we know the distribution of heights. And so if you're in a temperate climate, which a lot of us are, you can often assume that height and age of trees are at least correlated in some way. And so this will give you an idea about how the age of the forest is. And what's really valuable about this, of course, we've done it at such a fine scale, down to the individual trees. You can cut up and information for a watershed, for your entire city, or even down to an individual property parcel. Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about doing these fine-scale mappings. We're mapping our trees and our other land cover features at a very fine scale, and we're doing things like mapping the patches at a fine scale, and then mapping the tree heights at a fine scale. But really, the power of the Urban Tree Canopy assessment is that it's detailed mapping that allows you to make decisions across a broad range of geographical boundaries. At the very finest scale, of course, that's the parcel data sets that we showed in an earlier example. But you can integrate socio-demographic information with your census boundaries, go up from there to your neighborhood boundaries, look at your cities, and then finally to the cross-jurisdictional boundaries such as your watersheds. So let's look at some examples about how the Urban Tree Canopy assessment can be aggregated in those ways. Many of you will recognize sort of the distinct river pattern in this image. So this is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And here we have the neighborhood boundaries. And so for each neighborhood, we've computed the existing tree canopy from our land cover data. This next slide shows the surface temperature for each one of those neighborhoods. This was mapped from a satellite such as Landsat. It does relatively coarse 60-meter resolution thermal data, but very valuable when we aggregate this stuff up to the neighborhood level. And so now we have two data sets that we can merge together at a unit of analysis that's meaningful to the people in our community. We know the amount of tree canopy in each one of these neighborhoods, and then we know how hot those neighborhoods are. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the ecosystem services that trees provide, but these can be difficult to illustrate. Take health, for example. It's really challenging to go out and do a detailed health survey in your community and relate information such as asthma or obesity or longevity to tree canopy. We know those patterns exist, but we don't always have concrete data for each and every community. Surface temperature, thanks to the Landsat satellite, is something we can get for every community. So we can combine that information with our tree canopy data to come up with some of these meaningful patterns. So let's take a look at all of these neighborhoods here within the city of Pittsburgh. So each one of these circles here represents a neighborhood. On your x-axis, you have the surface temperature in degrees Fahrenheit measured from the satellite, and on the y-axis, you have the amount of existing tree canopy in each one of those neighborhoods. We've also got some other information displayed here. We've got the percent impervious and the number of crimes per person. And we see this really clear inverse relationship between surface temperature and tree canopy, right? As the amount of tree canopy increases, we see a drop in the surface temperature. This is incredibly valuable for the community because if you're in one of those neighborhoods that benefits from tree canopy, you're cooler, you're going to have less risk of vulnerable populations dying in a high heat event, and then your businesses are going to be paying a lot less for air conditioning. And now we've integrated some other neighborhood data. This is neighborhood crime data, so we have per capita crime, and that's what's symbolized in the color gradient. And then each one of those circles is sized according to the amount of tree canopy, that existing tree canopy, land cover. And these types of graphics also help illustrate the patterns that we've talked about before, where you have neighborhoods where a lot of things are wrong. There's not a lot of trees there, they're very hot, and they're high crimes. And this can really help focus your neighborhood rejuvenation and planning efforts. And there's other types of planning that we can do. And let's take a look at a watershed example. Here we have a tri-county area, and we're going to take a look at 4 very different watersheds. We're going to take a look at information that will help a planner, help an urban forester strategize about how to best approach increasing tree canopy in these watersheds. So this next infographic here breaks down the amount of possible tree canopy, that is the plantable area, in each one of these watersheds. Let's take a look at the top watershed there, the town of Newport, Ohio River. We see that that's a watershed that's very heavily developed. We see that most of the room to plant new trees is in residential land and rights-of-way, so we probably need some sort of private ownership outreach there if we want to increase tree canopy, but also a street tree planting initiative is going to work very, very well. Let's go down to the bottom and take a look at the upper 10 Mile Creek there. It's an agricultural-dominated watershed, so we probably want to think about establishing trees within riparian buffers on agricultural lands, because of course we're not going to plant trees on our agricultural land actively being farmed, and then after that it's focused on a private initiative of reaching out to residential landowners. So this type of information in which we summarize and aggregate data up can really help you better understand and plan for your initiatives. Here's another example. We had a community that was interested in planting trees near large forest patches on riparian buffers and hydric soils. And so we identified a priority matrix for them that helps identify those locations that meet those 3 criteria. And now we can present that information in short infographics, in more detailed reports. And this is very valuable. Maybe you've got 2 minutes with a city council. You can give them the 1-page infographic, or you want your planners who hope to have a more detailed 15-page report. Now, I mentioned early on that we can go back and revisit and map change over time, and that's really valuable to help you understand the changes to tree canopy in your community and if your initiatives are working out as you hope they would. Now, just to sort of give you some highlights about what we're doing in the future, we're mapping tree canopy now for very, very large areas. We just released a 1-meter resolution tree canopy data set for the entirety of the state of Pennsylvania. And it's very, very detailed, 1-meter resolution. You can see some highlights in the upper right-hand corner. So the costs of doing tree canopy mapping are coming down, and we're hoping to make that source data, that land cover data, more accessible to more less to do these assessments. And finally, I'd like to just wrap up here quickly by talking about what are the things that can make an urban tree canopy assessment successful. The people are really important. Make sure you don't just involve your urban foresters, but your planners and your GIS staff. It's a very data-driven exercise, and having those people on board is crucial. Think about who your consortium are, your partners, the nonprofits, the other governmental entities, and the private sector. Having your GIS people on board will help you better understand the data framework. The better data you have, the more accurate and the lower the cost to the project. And then finally, the funding. Sometimes we think, well, this should be from the urban forestry budget, but think about how much your community is spending on property parcel mapping, building mapping, road mapping, all those things, and paying for all the great data that we use in this. Chances are that's many, many, many times higher than what you're going to pay for an urban tree canopy. And so that wraps up the presentation on my end, so I'll turn it back to you, Jill. Thanks so much.